From Cape to Cairo, Mozambique to Morocco, Somalia to Senegal, the continent of Africa is beset with life-threatening, large-scale problems. Famine and starvation, civil war and boundary bickering, crippling debt and crumbling infrastructure, plummeting economic performance and soaring population growth, burgeoning human disease, and a devastated physical environment are features of everyday life in almost all parts of Africa. International lust for the enormous mineral and resource riches of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, abetted by international indifference, has turned much of the country into a colossal rape mine where more than 300,000 women and girls have been brutalized. Mapped locations of the mass rapes in the DRC correspond to coltan mining regions. Yves Ensler, founder of V-Day, said that rape is being used as a deliberate tool to control people and territory. The rapes are systematic, horrific, and often involve bands of rebels infected with HIV/AIDS. Hundreds of women and children were raped yesterday, hundreds more today. This is an economic war that uses terror as its main weapon to ensure warlords and their bands control regions where international companies mine for valuable metals like tin, silver, and coltan, or extract lumber and diamonds. Coltan is a rare and extremely valuable metal used in cell phones, DVD players, computers, digital cameras, video games, vehicle airbags, and more. It has long been implicated as both the source of funding and primary cause of the ongoing conflict and extraordinary violence against women. The brutal treatment of women in the Congo in order to control the local population is a tragic metaphor for the long history of exploitation of Africa by imperialist powers. The violence began long before European colonization, but this and the following neocolonialism are the focus of this video. Africa has always been attractive to those pursuing wealth because of its abundance in resources. Some of the first of these resources which brought Europeans to the shores of Africa were human.
In the late 1800s, imperialist European nations gained control over much of Africa. Imperialism is the domination of one country's political, economic, or cultural life by another. European countries have been establishing colonies and building empires since the late 1400s. Imperialism brought wealth and power to Europeans. But the people living in colonies were often oppressed, abused, and in some cases even killed.
In 40 years, Europe gobbled up virtually all of Africa south of the Sahara. It happened with tremendous speed, with tremendous brutality. The purpose of this conquest, like most conquests in history, was to make money for the conquerors, and they did so hand over fist and killed millions of people in the process.
Most Europeans thought colonization was essentially a noble undertaking. After all, they said, Europeans had strong economies, well-organized governments, and powerful armies and navies. Meanwhile, African nations were troubled by economic weakness and political divisions. The transatlantic slave trade, which did not end until the 1800s, had drastically reduced the populations of African societies. The slave trade had also contributed to intertribal warfare. European power was fueled by the technology of the Industrial Revolution. New weapons and steam-powered locomotives and ships gave Europeans the ability to move quickly and fight wars with brutal efficiency.
The term "scramble for Africa" conveys the haste with which the African continent was partitioned between the European powers, mainly in the brief period between 1884 and 1914. The scramble began in November 1884 with the Berlin Conference on the Partition of Africa, called by the German Chancellor Bismarck, and ended with the outbreak of the First World War. By then the initial partition was complete. The political map of Africa in 1914 closely resembles the modern political map. The partition was imposed on the continent with little regard to the distribution of peoples, ethno-linguistic or culture groups, or pre-colonial political units. The European colonies were created by imposing a mesh of boundary lines on Africa with an almost total disregard for local conditions. Diverse culture groups were lumped together within a single colonial territory, whilst at the same time individual culture groups were divided between colonies with indifference. Definite boundary lines replaced the more traditional borderlands. On the morning of her independence in 1962, Uganda's future looked promising. But this optimism was soon overwhelmed, and for decades Uganda suffered under the ruthless dictatorship of Idi Amin Dada and Milton Obote, tyrants who acquired power by coup d'etat and maintained it through fear, harassment, torture, internment camps, and genocide. Uganda's political, economic, and social institutions were devastated, people scarred by years of hellish terror and loss of life. So what went wrong? The answer lies in colonial history, the process of colonization, colonial administration, and eventual decolonization. During her conquest and rule of this country, the British Empire both intensified and created divisions in Ugandan society. Once decolonization became politically and financially expedient after World War II, Great Britain left Uganda unstable and ill-prepared to govern itself. Ethnic rivalries contributed to much of the instability in Uganda's early democratic government. Because Ugandans had had so little experience in representative government, they lacked the skills to create a unified democratic state. Instead, Uganda soon fell under the rule of dictators who governed as colonialists had for so many years, through force and violence. Officials during this regime adopted the practices of their predecessors, so the corruption and abuse of power first established under the agency system and indirect rule continued. These and other factors are responsible for the chaos and destruction that has characterized most of post-colonial Uganda. The 1994 Rwandan genocide of hundreds of thousands of Tutsis and moderate Hutus is another example of how colonization and decolonization would continue to destabilize the African continent for years to come. Prior to the arrival of Europeans, Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda had lived peaceably together for many years, and boundaries between the two groups were flexible. However, the Germans set up a system of indirect rule based on the essentialist belief that Tutsi domination was the natural traditional order of Rwanda. After World War I, the Belgians, who acquired Rwanda as a trusteeship, simplified Rwanda's previously complex system of governance into a single hierarchical structure purged of almost all Hutu chiefs. By also closing off Hutu access to higher education and thus to administrative jobs, Hutus were essentially denied political representation and economic opportunities. Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa identities were firmly solidified of ethnic identity cards beginning in 1926. By fostering the idea of a superior race, European powers created potent ethnic fault lines that exploded in 1994.